Hello, my name is Tom Hazlett. I'm on the faculty here at George Mason University, and as director of the Information Economy Project, one of the perks is that I get to listen to some smart people, and in some cases very smart people. And in that tradition, we're delighted to have with us today Andrew Odlyzko, who's a professor of mathematics at the University of Minnesota. He's going to have to leave the talk early today because we're working on the algorithm for the possible number of NC2A basketball bracket outcomes. And he's got about half of it worked out right now. Andrew Odlyzko has an illustrious career as a mathematician. And in fact, you can go to Wikipedia and read all about it. He's well known in computational number theory, computational complexity, and he has an algorithm named after him, which is quite interesting. I have a fallacy actually named after me, so I think we're on the same track there. And he, with all his scientific and technical attributes, he's actually quite an interesting contributor to the information technology policy debate. That's how I know him, and that's how I came to admire his work. He has been quite prolific, writing on many of the topics that interest folks who are looking at the emergence of new networks. The New York Times last week ran an interesting story, Video Roadhogs Stir Fear of Internet Traffic Jam. A very substantial part of that article was to go to Professor Odlyzko and find out how fast Internet traffic was growing. And that's probably a good choice because in the late 1990s, when the markets were operating on a misprediction, a forecast put out, I think originally by WorldCom, that internet traffic was increasing at 100% every 3 months, one of the lone voices, and certainly the most influential and important voice in trying to point out some of the rationality on the other side of that prediction was Professor Odlyzko, who in fact warned people that internet traffic was growing very rapidly at about 100% every year, which was, I think, taken to be some sort of a fuddy-duddy prediction from a guy who just couldn't get with the new emergence of new networks, and was only 1/8 as enthusiastic about what was developing in the data field. And in fact, it turned out, of course, that Odlyzko, mischaracterized, I guess, as a pessimist by some, was exactly on the money. And so people today go to him rather than to WorldCom for the projections. Yeah, it's just a little viciousness on the part of tech people, I guess. But at any rate, I have, over the years, read many papers by Andrew Odlyzko. I have debated with him on many of the things he writes about, but never failed to learn a lot from what he writes. And today we're going to be hearing about something he's been putting together in a book that has to do with historic and current technology manias from 1840s Britain to 1990s USA. And we're delighted to have with us Andrew Odlyzko.
Thank you very much for the welcome, and thank you, Tom, for the very gracious introduction. So indeed, I would like to talk to you about technology manias, and specifically about two technology manias, the very recent Internet mania and something from 160 years ago, the British Railway mania of the 1840s. And I'll explain why that one is interesting and relevant. That was the greatest technology mania in history. But let me first start off with a word of warning. Namely, very little of what I say, has any relevance for the current financial crisis. Okay, in some sense, from a broad perspective, current crisis is like many other crises, technological or otherwise. The essentially almost invariable pattern is somebody finds something new to gold mine, so gather some of the gold dust, put it in a sack, and so on, they start circulating, and then somebody else takes some cow manure, puts it into a sack, sprinkles some gold dust on top, and maybe put some perfume on top also to conceal the smell, and starts passing it around together with the other gold sacks. And it goes on, and other people imitate it, until eventually something happens. Somebody, maybe inadvertently or out of curiosity, opens one of these sacks, or the perfume wears off and the smell becomes a little bit too strong, etc. And then suddenly things fall to pieces, and we get into a panic. Okay? And this is roughly where we are today. Okay? And by the way, this phenomenon of these cow manure sacks is something that can also happen with technology. This is, as I mentioned, fairly generic. In a stage where we are today, where you are in a panic stage, it really is very much on psychology, a lot of depends on policy decisions, on special circumstances, etc. I don't have any particular insight to give to Mr. Bernanke or Mr. Paulson or any of the other people on how to deal with the problem. I hope that they can manage to do it without a giant disaster. But the fact that such disasters happen, I mean, this has been true for a long, long time. Here is one of the cartoons from Punch during the time of the railway mania. These little boys, one talks to, the caption is, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. And indeed, this is kind of a very general phenomenon. During the giddy days of the bubble blowing up, everything goes very well. As long as you're not skeptical or cautious, you can make lots of money, you can feel really great until something happens. And so underneath that main caption, you have the exchange between these two boys. One asks the other, "What's a panic?" And the other says, "Lord, if I know, but I'm told there's one in the city." That's the equivalent of Wall Street in London. Okay? And panics come, and then you have to deal with them. Okay? So I will not be concentrating on this. I'll be talking more about technology manias, which are a little bit more concrete, where there is some kind of hard evidence that you get your hands on. What I mean by this is maybe illustrated by referring to something I will not be talking about much, namely the Dutch toilet bowl mania from the 17th century. It's a very interesting topic, has a very large literature. Most of what's known about it, probably most of what you have read about it, is wrong. Okay? Most of it is based on a book by Charles Mackay called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. First published in 1841, just between two British railway manias. It's an extraordinarily poor book. It's really very famous, but as history, it's totally unreliable. Okay, it draws on some moralistic tracks, has no really concrete hard evidence. There's much better work. In particular, just last year, a book was published by N. Goldgard, a British historian, on the toilet bowl mania, who analyzed it. And it's very interesting. First of all, Dutch toilet bowl mania did not bring down the Dutch economy. It wasn't quite a tempestuous teapot, but it was very small. It involved a small number of people. It was a fairly small, cohesive group of Mennonite merchants who were trading in tulips. And indeed, tulips, I mean, some of the stories you hear in other places about a tulip bulb selling for as much as a house or more, or several houses, that's true. That was true before the mania. That was also true after the mania. There was a great value in scarcity. Sometimes because of processes that we now understand, kind of mutations that took place, the Dutch did not understand at the time. Occasionally there will be very unusual, colorful varieties showing up, which would attract very high prices. Okay? So, in some sense, some people have even, there's another chap, Gerber, who has tried to argue that tulip mania was not all that irrational. I have some doubts, but it's a somewhat ambiguous situation. The main thing is that it was based on expectations. There's some very little, very solid to it. And in fact, you can tell this, that there was kind of mass psychology at work by how it developed. So the Dutch toilet bowl mania blows up in the fall of 1636. Okay? Now at that stage, the kind of bulbs have been planted, they are in the ground, and prices continue climbing. They climb through November, December, January, kind of end of February, early March. Suddenly, there's a crash. Somehow people decide, these bulbs are not going to be worth as much as they expected. Okay? Now nobody knows anything about what those bulbs are going to be like. The bulbs do not actually come up They don't come out of the ground till sometime in April. There's a very colorful Tullock grounds in Holland. You can still see each year, etc. So there was no objective evidence, but somehow group dynamics persuaded these people that maybe they had overdone it and there was a crash. So I'm not saying this was irrational. Maybe it was just kind of a rational process of mass psychology, people trying to figure out what other people were going to value these unknown bulbs at, etc. But it's not something that I can kind of quantifiably, empirically evaluate. Okay? So I'm more about technology manias. So these are cases where in some situations at least you can say, for example, in the case of the gold dust sacks, you find that there are at least 1,000 sacks of supposedly gold dust circulating. You say go over or fly over the gold mine, and you discover only about 100 sacks worth of sand has been dug up. Something's gone wrong. Okay? You don't necessarily know who has the cow manure, who has the true gold dust, but you know that something's wrong. Okay? And this happens sometimes in technology. So that's what I'm really after, technology manias. Okay, so I mentioned so panics occur. Now, the main points I want to make is, first of all, you have to be very careful. And in fact, we can interpret my lecture as saying that in many cases, you shouldn't just simply dismiss a sudden run-up in prices or really kind of mania-type excitement about the technology as destined to fail. Okay? Technology prediction is very hard. Okay? Technomanias are rooted in human mass psychology, ways that we don't understand. Maybe sometime in the future there will be no better understanding of how it works. There are several common patterns in technomanias. Also, some technomanias can be predicted to fail. Okay? Occasionally you can come up and say, look, there are 1,000 sacks of supposedly gold dust, but only 100 sacks have been dug up. Something's wrong. Somebody is going to be very, very sorry. Okay? And in particular, that's what happened with the telecom bubble a few years ago, what happened with the British railway mania in the 1840s. Something that happens is kind of what I call beautiful illusions and credulous simplicity lead to collective hallucinations. And these are people who get involved in these things are often kind of leading business and technology leaders in society, very smart people, and they figure out ways to rationalize things. Okay? And they kind of concoct consistent pictures which just simply happen to be at variance with the facts, but are very, very hard to kind of get people away from that train of thinking. Okay? Some other speculations. I'll talk about future technomanias. I suspect that some of the bad ones meaning the ones destined to fail, may become harder to identify in the future for certain reasons. And finally, since this is a presentation in law school, I thought it would be useful to mention I'm convinced that lawyers will find intellectually challenging and very remunerative work in connection with manias. That has been a consistent pattern all through the history. Okay, so problems with technology prediction. So of course we know that the internet bubble failed. Lots of people lost a lot of money. Lots of people were very sorry. Lots of people had their careers derailed, etc. But not all technology predictions fail by being over-optimistic. Very often these predictions are too pessimistic. In particular, my former employer, AT&T, failed to some extent, but in a measurable extent, because it didn't pay enough attention to wireless. Okay? So Bell Labs, part of AT&T, did some of the early pioneering work on wireless about 50, 60 years ago, then got so neglected, regulatory issues, many, many long stories. But just about 25 years ago, as our Bell system was about to be broken up, AT&T commissioned a study by McKinsey of the future of cellular. So the government was moving towards licensing cellular frequencies. Services were going to become available. And the question for AT&T was how much emphasis to put on that area. And McKinsey, after looking at the situation carefully, reported that by the year 2000, in North America, there would be a grand total of 800,000 subscribers. Okay? There turned out to be 100 million at that point. Okay? And this wasn't, by the way, peculiar just to AT&T. Consulted for Nokia a while ago. They kind of showed me some predictions people made around 1990 when internal projections